This is, to say the least, as a history professor, this is not my usual audience, and so it's an honor and a pleasure to have the opportunity to address you today on some elements of my own research, but also to kind of round out what Dr. Levis was talking about. My specialty and what I'm going to be discussing today is really the movement of African peoples into the Western Hemisphere, to serve kind of as a backdrop for understanding some of the disparities, the health disparities that linger throughout our hemisphere. And this is going to be a very condensed version of the chapter that's been prepared for the volume that Dr. Levis described, and a condensed version as well of the talk that was presented at ICHAD. Just to kind of to dovetail what Dr. Levis was saying, it is remarkable that over 150 to 160 million peoples of African descent live within our hemisphere. And it's true, Dr. Levis is correct, that between 10 to 15 million people were brought to the New World during the period from 1500 to roughly 1898, the period of the African slave trade. And what is striking is the degree to which the preponderance of peoples of African descent who live in our hemisphere are really living in Latin America. Roughly 76 million peoples of African descent live in Brazil, which is by far the largest concentration of peoples of African descent outside of Africa, outside of Nigeria. But what this table shows you, what this graphic shows you, is kind of the distribution, and I apologize, I thought it might be a little bit easier to see. The distribution of peoples of African descent relative to their national populations distributed throughout Latin America. I guess the take-home message, really the take-home message is that not a single country has been left untouched by the African presence. And there are some surprises. Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, Cuba, Panama have very, very important populations of African descent. Now, there's something else that I wanted to touch upon as I continue this journey with you. Now, just how is it that peoples of African descent began arriving to this hemisphere? Contrary to popular belief, the dawn of African arrivals in the West is not solely a slave story. Beginning as late as the late 1490s and extending into the opening decades of the 16th century, small streams of blacks began landing on the shores of Latin America as auxiliaries to the Spanish missions of conquest and discovery. Now, many did not migrate directly from Africa, but had spent significant time being seasoned in Europe. Many blacks became part of scattered black European communities, specifically Iberian communities, that is the fusion of Spain and Portugal. And by the early 1500s, cities such as Seville and Lisbon, as well as their hinterland regions, including Spain's Rio Tinto region, which is between the region of Malaga and Huelva, which on this map, if you see that circle, that's something that I've identified as a black zone. It's kind of this hinterland region that has a substantial number, at least at this particular period of time, 1490s, early 1500s, has substantial numbers of peoples of African descent. This is surprising, and in fact, those of you who are able to go to the Walters Museum in Baltimore will have a chance to see kind of the impact that peoples of African descent had in this period. The black presence, revealing the African presence in Renaissance Europe, is on display. It's the first time the first time that such an exhibit has been leveled anywhere in the world that they can actually see the artwork that's produced that shows and documents the black presence. So I encourage those of you in that region to please take a visit and get into this a little bit more. By the 1550s, as I said, as much as 10% of Lisbon's population was black. From a smattering of literary works and paintings, we are also aware that some blacks in Spain were occasionally able to achieve considerable renown, including the scholar Juan Latino, who became a university professor and a chair at the University of Granada in the 1500s, having been born a slave and accompanying his master to school. His master was not the brightest tool in the shed, so to speak. And so what he did was he had his slave accompany him, and his slave got all soaked in all the knowledge and ended up becoming a professor, while the white Spaniard became a noble. So it's interesting how even failing in school, you can kind of still ascend if you're white in this particular period. And some things, some might argue, haven't changed so much. I don't want to get into that. But by the 1490s, also the nearly 800 years of sustained contact between the Moors and peoples of Iberia meant also that its culture had been deeply imprinted by blacks who were undeniably woven into the fabric of the social landscape. Now, that some of these blacks would journey to a new world should not require a stretch of your imagination. In fact, we can postulate that that in the 1490s, most peoples of Africa coming to the Americas were likely to have been free, accompanying the missions of Spanish discovery, and at least some of these were minimally armed. In this period of initial European contact, with few people of any race traveling across the Atlantic, these initial cohorts of blacks probably numbered no more than several dozen. Now, between 1502 and 1510, which corresponded roughly to the culmination of the early exploratory expeditions in the Caribbean, this pace started to increase, with blacks starting to come in by the hundreds. 1502 marked a pivotal year in that this was the period when Queen Isabella formally appointed the governor to what was known as Hispaniola, which is the fusion of Haiti and the Dominican Republic today. And this act was incredibly important because it signaled that Spain would not just look at its holdings in the New World as a profit-driven kind of place where you just set up some ports and extract through really some mechanisms, really bartering with the native population. But now it meant that firmly the Spaniards would be colonizing this region deeply, bringing in settlers and setting up shop. What this meant is that blacks now started to stream into the Americas in new capacities. They were merchants' agents. They were supervisors of Native American labor gangs and mining gangs. They were personal servants who themselves occupied a laundry list of professions. During the 1510s, the era of Spanish exploration grew, focusing on military conquests that increased in scope and scale during the 1520s and 30s. Scholars who have been writing about this period consider these blacks to have been virtually indispensable to the Spanish mission of conquest. Beginning with Mexico in 1519, and then moving to Peru in the 1530s, black freedmen and a small number of black slaves participated in overhauling and restructuring Native American regimes, the Inca of Peru, while also providing key physical labor that resulted in the construction of Spanish forts and a number of institutions and buildings. In fact, it's been rumored that most of the government buildings in early Latin America were constructed heavily by peoples of African descent. In the conquest of Peru, several thousand blacks were employed this way. On the military front, Pedro de Alvarado, who was a very renowned conqueror of his day, assembled a force of about 200 peoples of African descent. Among them, Juan Valiente, who was a heroic figure in the conquest of Chile. Some of these conquistadors, these black conquistadors, received great benefits for their services, including gold, including land, in amounts that were typically reserved for elite Spaniards. In Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, black conquistadors were routinely used as translators. Perhaps the best known of these is staring at you in the face, and he's known to us in the United States as Black Stephen. Speaking 7 languages, he helped explore significant portions of what is today the southwestern parts of the United States. Now, unfortunately for the vast majority of these black conquistadors, whatever wealth and status that they had been able to acquire in the earliest years of the Spanish conquest were subject to rapid demise, as white Spaniards fought vigorously to seize their lands and also their material riches. Even those who had been able to bequeath some of their wealth to their children and grandchildren, one of these, Juan Garrido, one of the famous black conquistadors of Mexico, who you're looking at now, even individuals such as this, by the 1650s, their families had largely faded from historical record, and they had really sunk to a level of poverty. Regardless, however, their role and their preeminence and their prominence, really, in establishing the colonial regime is worthy of undeniable remembrance. Now, returning to the other side of the Atlantic, by the mid-1500s, the trade in African slaves was increasing, bringing in new and substantially more diverse populations into the Americas. As slavery began to take off in the 16th century, it did so exponentially, in volume, ultimately flowing to the New World with a vengeance by the beginning of the 18th century. By the end of slavery, with its final abolition in Brazil in 1888, Some have estimated, as we've discussed, between 10 to 15 million Africans across the Atlantic. Now, these were impressive numbers in the overall story of New World migration. Before 1820, nearly 3/4 of all people who entered the Americas were black slaves. Of these, just 4% landed in what is today the United States. The remainder sailed to Brazil, 35%, you can see in this pie chart, the Caribbean, 37%, and the Spanish mainland, roughly 12%. By and large, the transatlantic slave trade followed a pattern that drew slaves progressively in greater increments as one moved southward along the western portion of the African continent. So if we were to divide the African continent into 4 main regions: Upper Guinea, stretching from the Senegal River to territories in modern Liberia; Lower Guinea, extending from the western Ivory Coast to Cameroon; Angola, encompassing territory from the coast of modern Angola into Zaire; and finally Mozambique. The initial zone exploited for slaves was Upper Guinea, among the closest regions to Spanish America. So there's no coincidence that you're going to want to get slaves from as close as you can to your continent. Shipping and trade was conducted primarily on Portuguese vessels during this early period, since they were the first major European explorers of the African coastline. The early Portuguese preeminence among European slave traders was quickly challenged. In the 17th century, the Dutch, the British, and the French eased their way into the trade, eventually becoming the primary motors of slave commerce in the 18th century. Now, one of the strategies that these different countries used to gain a foothold in Africa was basically to outflank the Portuguese monopoly. They were driving trade further southward. And as they did this, as they tried to circumvent the places where the Portuguese had a foothold, they then drove the trade itself further southward. Now, some of this was hotly contested. A number of wars were precipitated. Some of the most damaging and well-known of these were in the Angola region, and the Africans themselves got into the action. This dangerous game of geopolitics that was now played by African European nations meant that by the 17th century, and certainly during the rise of the great plantation economies of the British and French Caribbean, West Central Africa, again, or that region that you see on the map as Angola, would become one of the major departure points for slaves, bearing an extremely important cultural imprint on the Americas. Now, certainly in the 18th century, attempts were made by various nations to reestablish strong trade with Upper Guinea. However, their efforts were met with limited success at best. And some of this actually had to do with the Africans themselves. We don't give the Africans enough credit for their ability to actually fight and thwart European penetration into the continent. In fact, when we really study the motions of the European forces in Africa, it's really a coastal presence. It's only in Angola where they started to penetrate deeply, where they were able to develop certain alliances with African kingdoms, where they started to actually garner a bigger foothold. But really, it's a coastal presence, and the Europeans had to reconcile their wishes with African timing and with African wills. The slaves that arrived in the Americas, although they represented a multitude of dialects, cultural experiences, and nationalities, actually shared a number of important commonalities between them that helped bind them together in the New World. As slave ships docked in certain regions, they actually didn't bring with them extremely diverse cargoes of individuals. They usually made 1 or 2 stops at most before they made a trip back to the New World. And what this meant is that, by and large, these slave ships tended to carry a more homogeneous population than we've started to, than scholars have typically realized in the past. It has become increasingly clear that African slaves then probably arrived to the New World in clusters. This is to say that at certain moments in time, slaves from particular regions in Africa nucleated in specific parts of the Americas. On the one hand, the simple realities of geography help dictate the patterns of trade. The flows of Atlantic wind currents and the distance from African ports to the New World shipping points meant that certain regions were simply more accessible for some seaborne vessels than others. 2 broad transport systems developed. A North Atlantic system, which I have, you see there's the top kind of circular line going from Africa back to the New World and back, and a South Atlantic system, which is the second group, the second era. And this North Atlantic system traditionally linked Upper Guinea with areas like the United States, northern Brazil, and the Caribbean. And that South Atlantic system integrated West Central Africa and Angola with southeastern Brazil. To some degree, the practice of transshipping slaves within ports of the New World affected the integrity of these systems, but it did not eliminate the principal thrusts of their flows. The ethnic composition and clustering of African slaves in various parts of the Americas was also influenced by the response of individual African kingdoms to the slave trade. As I mentioned earlier, not all African polities sought to be included in transatlantic commerce, and they resisted the impulse to sell slaves. Others used their military and political power to enter and exit the trade at will. In Haiti, the slave trade started to become more prominent when it was formalized by an official decree of the Spanish government in 1518. And nearly 30 years after the discovery of the New World, the slavery then started to take off rapidly from here. Now, as a matter of counterpoint, in British North America, we know that the first 20-odd Negroes, as the saying goes, arrived in Port Comfort outside of Norfolk, Virginia, in 1619. In the Spanish-speaking world, after 1518, slavery followed a variety of routes. Typically, it used the Caribbean as an anchor before spreading out to other parts of Latin America. But pathways were also carved into places like Argentina and Peru, sometimes flowing to the southern port of Buenos Aires. So you can imagine slave ships coming from Angola, they're going all the way down to Buenos Aires, and then slaves coming in to Latin America and also flowing upward into Brazil from there. What you're looking at here is a map that identifies 3 of the major slave ports of the New World in red. Veracruz in Mexico, Portobelo in Panama, and Cartagena in modern-day Colombia. And so these are the 3 major entry points of African slaves into the New World. And really, slaves appeared in the most unlikely of places: Bolivia, Paraguay, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Chile, Ecuador. And they came in staggering numbers. I won't get into that in detail. I encourage you to follow Dr. Levise's publication when it comes out for more. And also, the last thing I want to leave you with is just kind of a sense of scale. Of the 10 to 15 million African slaves that arrived, again, millions went to Latin America, and surprisingly, half of the slave trade before 1650 went to Mexico, another half went to Peru. And what this has done is left a legacy. It's left a legacy that we're still starting to wrestle with. What does this large African presence mean to the cultural and social development of these countries? It has meant a tremendous evolution of these populations. In fact, the African imprint oftentimes has gone unrecognized, but has been part of the cultural glue of these various societies. And so as really in the next several years, UNESCO has announced that this is the decade of the black in our hemisphere. You'll be seeing a lot more of this. This is just the beginning of the research in this area. Thank you so much for your time and attention this week.